Hello, welcome to Legal Action. My name is Dave Siegel. Thanks for joining us once again. I'm joined by my co-host, Jesse Variantes. Jesse, nice to see you again.
Nice to see you too, Dave.
Okay, today we're going to be talking about landlord-tenant law, which very popular. Is that right, Jesse?
Oh, absolutely. Everybody either owns or majority rent.
You either own, you rent, or you live with family, right?
That's correct.
Well, we're going to talk about the one where you rent. And we have a special guest today, Nisi Jackson. Welcome to Legal Action. How are you today?
I'm fine. Thanks for asking.
We have you on the show because you are a prospective tenant. You are looking for an apartment that you would like to rent, correct?
That is correct.
And what type of apartment or what type of house, what type of facility are you looking to rent?
Two-bedroom apartment.
Okay, two-bedroom apartment. Jesse, what should she be looking for in a two-bedroom apartment in terms of a lease?
Well, I mean, there are a lot of things. Actually, I have one question for you, though. First is, have you ever rented apartments in the past?
Yes, I have.
Okay. And with some of those, or probably most of them, you've received a lease, have you?
That is correct.
Okay, which is either double-sided legal page or several letter-sized pages?
That is correct.
Now, I want to ask you, have you really actually read the terms of that lease?
No, I basically glanced through them.
And somebody explains it to you, and then you just go ahead and sign or initial where they tell you to do that.
That is correct.
Right? And that's really not uncommon. A lot of people do that. People do that with their home mortgages, even with their car leases or anything else like that.
Oh, wait, you said you didn't read the lease, but obviously some of the terms had to be very important to you that you had to get out in the open either orally or someone had to explain to you what certain terms were. What was important to you about the lease, mostly?
Well, I was asking how much would they be looking for as far as security. Would there be a month or 2 months security in advance? Mm-hmm. And what are some of the terms that the lease would cover? Would it be utilities involved? Would that be included in the rent? Water, sewer? Did you have a price point in mind as to what it would cost you per month to live in that unit? Or was that not the issue? That was not the issue.
Okay, so you had the wherewithal to pay almost anything for a lease, or it had to be some factor, correct?
Exactly. I wanted to reach a certain point. It was a point I didn't want to go above my head because I knew that I would be signing something, a contract, and if I break this contract, there was chances that would make my credit bad.
Sure. Jesse, is it fair to say that a lot of people who are renting look for the price per month and really don't look much beyond that in terms of a lease?
A lot of people do because they're interested in getting into, and a lot of times they're really short for time. And they need to get someplace for whatever reason and to get locked into something. And so what they're interested in is exactly what they can afford. So, right. Okay, they have a price in mind, but not only what they can afford, but as you mentioned too, is the security deposit. How much is that kind of going to cost me? So what am I going to have to really come up with? If it's $1,000 a month, okay, is it going to be $2,000, $3,000? What am I going to need? Then what are some of those additional expenses that are going to be required?
Beyond the monthly rent, the term, and the security deposit, what should someone like Nisi Jackson look for in a lease to protect her interest?
Well, what you should really do is to look at all of the terms of lease. Now, there are, as I said before, there are different kinds of leases. There's the standard lease that you can buy at the office supply store, and there's leases that people kind of gear toward themselves, or even leases dependent upon where you rent. Maybe it's a bigger complex that their attorneys have drawn up. And I'm here to tell you that generally most of those leases are slanted and geared towards the landlord. Now, there's also leases that people have drawn up on their own, and that's something I don't recommend because you really need to know what you're doing in terms of the terms and everything else. But what you need to have with those the types of terms is the first thing you want to know, right, is the premise.
Right.
What
are you renting?
What are you renting exactly? And are you going to have access to any of the common areas? For example, a lot of times you'll have like a storage locker or something of that nature, mm-hmm. and a lot of times it's included. Sometimes, however, they'll charge you. I mean, a good example of that would be a garage.
Garage.
Exactly. There's an extra.
Right. Is parking included, or do you have to pay extra for that?
Right. You want to look at that. You want to know what your term is, right? Is this going to be a yearly lease, or are you going to be locked in for a couple of years, 3 years, or is it going to, a lot of times they have a different kind of tenancy, which is just month to month, where there is no written lease. And that is kind of okay for some people who don't mind if there's a problem. The difficulty with that is, hey, on 30 days' notice, they can terminate the tenancy and you can get out of there. So those are just kind of some of the basic. And of course, we talked about the price, what you're looking for, and the security deposit. What about possession, Dave? Do you think that's an important term?
Sure, possession is very important. When can you have the unit? Who can you have in the unit? Whether you can have multiple people living in the premises, whether or not you're allowed to have pets, what you can do in the premises.
Exactly, remodeling or decorating or what you need to do for that.
Right. I think it's very important. You want to make sure that you're able to use the premises in the way that you want to. If you want to have parties, if you want to have guests over, if you want to have animals, you better make sure that the lease doesn't say only one occupant or 2 adults or no pets. You want to make sure. Now, I think, Jesse, a lot of people feel when they enter into a lease agreement, especially at a huge complex that has more than 50 or units or so, that they feel that they don't have the ability to negotiate any of the terms, and that it's just basically an adhesion lease where they either sign or they're not getting the unit. And that's
right.
a mistake.
And just so for the folks at home, a lease of adhesion is basically just that. Hey, it's either my way or the highway, take it or leave it. But the truth is that a lot of these places, things are negotiable.
Right.
So, and here's the thing, and this is true with anything, all right? If you don't ask, you won't know.
No.
All somebody can tell you is no, right? And so you're in exactly the same position you would have been in, had you not asked. But they can also say yes. And so let's say the lease maybe says only 2 occupants, all right? Okay. Now, I mean, there are different building codes with respect to the size of the apartment. I mean, you can't have 12 people living in a one-bedroom apartment, okay?
Right.
But kind of, absent that kind of thing, hey, if you ask, you want to get those things up front. And truth is that a lot of times they will negotiate those kinds of terms, even perhaps price. They'll even do some move-in specials and that kind of thing. So sure. You want to, it's a marketing kind of deal. I mean, you want to try to get the best deal that you can. And so, hey, it does not hurt to ask. You know what? There are apartments all over the place. Your money is good anywhere. And people want to fill their buildings. And so they're willing to make accommodations.
After hearing this, Ms. Jackson, what are you going to look for in your lease when you find that apartment that you really like? What are you going to look for when that landlord tenders you the lease and says, can you sign for me?
Well, basically, I'll take considerable time to read through the lease. Jesse pointed that out, and that's a good point, before signing. And I would ask questions as to, can I have someone live with me, or can I have an animal, or, can I decorate the apartment the way I want it to, or should I leave things as is? Sometimes you may move in an apartment where it has the hardwooden floors. I want to know if I could put carpet down over it. Those are things I would look for, basically.
Right. I would also like to advise you that you should consider when the rent is due, what day of the month, and what the late fee is. Because there's a lot of leases out there where if you don't pay by the first and you're 1 day late, there's a huge penalty for paying your rent late.
Oh, my God. I wasn't aware of that.
And an NSF, non-sufficient funds fee as well.
Sure.
That you'll get hit with, so you get hit double the problem. There's also, depending upon what you rent these days, sometimes it's an apartment, sometimes you may even be renting a condo from someone who owns a condo,
sure.
Or maybe even renting a house. And when you go to those kind of things, it's also important to consider some additional terms, like, for example, who's going to be responsible for the property taxes? Right?
Who's going to pay the condo association fees?
Exactly. And generally, now that's something that should be considered when you're talking about the total amount, whatever the rent is going to be. Let's use the example of $1,000.
So excuse me, those are things I should look for that may not be in the contract. Is that correct? So
they should be in the contract, but the landlord may not have put them in there.
Right. But you want it to be aware of that because taxes are dependent upon where you live. Can be expensive. And hey, you want to make sure that the landlord is going to maintain those things and is going to pay it, because guess what? If the landlord doesn't pay those things and doesn't pay them for a certain amount of time, there's the possibility of foreclosure, and then guess what? You're going to have a problem perhaps later on down the line.
Okay.
You also want to look at the idea of property insurance. Now,
sure.
I recommend to everybody, renter's insurance doesn't really cost a whole lot of money, but it's really invaluable.
Without a doubt, you should have renter's insurance.
And what does rental insurance cover? Like if you move in the apartment and something breaks, the insurance would cover that?
It'll cover your personal items, theft, for example, And there are different kinds of policies you can get. Even if somebody falls in your apartment, you can. It just depends on the policy.
Yes.
If something leaks and your stuff gets damaged,
Okay.
It should cover that. A lot of places have additional insurance. For example, water beds. I don't know if they're really that big nowadays, but they used to be. And if you were in an apartment complex, you were required to get actual waterbed insurance because if something happened, you wanted to be kind of covered with respect to that.
In addition to the personal property that would be covered under renter's insurance, you may need to get an additional rider to cover an item such as a ring or expensive jewelry. That would be additional insurance that you might want to think about getting if you're renting, because it's not as safe as home ownership with an alarm system and all that good stuff.
Okay.
That's correct.
Well, Jesse, let's say she finds the apartment that she likes. Let's just say, for example, it's in Maywood, which is in our viewing audience.
Sure.
Okay.
And she finds herself in this apartment, everything is going well, and then all of a sudden, the boss turns on her, she loses her job, and guess what? Can't pay the rent. Have you ever been in that situation before, ever in your life, or known anybody in that situation, Nisi?
I've known someone in that situation where they lost their job and couldn't pay their rent, and they got evicted.
Okay. You're not 100% familiar with the entire process that had to occur to get evicted, correct?
That is correct. All I know is that the young lady lost her job and she couldn't afford to pay her rent. Okay. Unemployment check had not, came through, and she didn't have any other funds available.
Sure. Jesse, if you can talk a little bit about the steps that are involved before somebody actually gets evicted, because it's not an overnight situation. It's a little bit longer.
It takes a long. Actually, but before we get into that, I think there are just a couple of things that I wanted to hit that are kind of important.
Sure.
In terms of when you're renting. I think one of the things you need to kind of look at too is a lot of times in the lease it'll have what they call default. Now, default is what constitutes a breach of that agreement. And
obviously a failure to pay the rent.
Failure to pay the rent, and generally they do say that. But you want to see if there are any other events of default. And you want to make sure you know what that is.
Sure.
Because a lot of these leases will also provide, and generally the forms that you buy at the office supply store have those, a payment of attorney's fees and costs if you do default. So if that happens and you do end up getting evicted, you may end up having to pay the attorney more than just the rent, over and above that. But the other thing too is a lot of times when you go through, you want to have like a checklist. And let's see here, we've got stuff. And a lot of times in the complexes, they'll have a little checklist of things that you'll sign off on. It'll talk about the bathrooms, the carpeting, the ceiling, all different, the stove, the refrigerator. You want to make sure that everything is in working condition when you move in. Okay? That if there's a hole in the rug or a hole in the ceiling, you want to make sure that that's noted and that they're going to fix it. And then it gets signed so that there's no problem. Hey, listen, this is how it was before I came in, and that you didn't do it, so you won't end up being responsible for that kind of thing.
Right.
And on the way out,
it's a protection of your security deposit, basically.
Okay.
It really is, and we'll talk about that. We'll talk about the other event, default on the security deposit too. Is you want to make sure that when you leave a premises, right, that you take pictures.
Yeah, you should actually do a walkthrough with the landlord if you can.
And they'll sign off on a similar agreement.
The premises are in the same good condition as when you lease them.
That's exactly right. Because that's one of the most common problems that I hear is that people end up, the landlord kept my security deposit. Now, what am I going to do? A lot of times it's not really extensive. It's not a whole lot of money. And so as a result, it doesn't make it financially feasible to really hire an attorney. Sometimes it does, depending upon the amount and depending upon the issues. But those are all important things. And if you can't get your landlord to walk through, even if you do, you still want to take pictures. And they'll end up signing something, and you want to make sure that you keep that document or copy of it. You want to have somebody come in with you to make sure. And then after you move, too, you want to make sure, because sometimes when you're moving, you might knock into the wall. Hey, take care of that, repair it, and make sure that everything is good to go. But now getting back to
let's fast forward. She's in the apartment. She can't pay her rent. What should she expect next, Jesse?
Well, what you should expect is to have a knock at the door or a phone call from the apartment manager that's going to say, hey, where's the rent money? Okay? And then what'll happen, you may, if you're lucky, be able to squeak a month or two out of that without paying before they file a lawsuit. Now, there are 5 things that basically you need in order for somebody to be kind of evicted. The first thing you need is for somebody to be late on their rent. Okay?
Or otherwise in default.
Or otherwise in default.
Okay.
Right. Okay. The second thing is that you need what they call the landlord's 5-day notice. They have to serve you with the 5-day notice. All right? The third thing is that you have to wait for the amount of time to expire after the 5-day notice. I remember, just for example, there was a situation that I had not too long ago where landlord served the 5-day notice. There really wasn't a breach, but even assuming there was a breach, served a 5-day notice, and the very next day, on the second day of the notice, they filed a lawsuit. Okay? And that's inappropriate, and we were able to resolve that. So you need for the time to pass, right?
Okay.
Okay, that's the third thing.
I want you to explain a little bit further what
Sure.
the 5-day notice is. You have 5 days to do what?
The notice, and it's outlined in the statute, that basically says that you have 5 days in order to make your full payment of the rent. And a lot of times, depending, and that's why it's very important, again, it depends on what side you're on. If you're the landlord, and a lot of times landlords will do it themselves, and that's not kind of recommended. You can buy forms, but you need to have somebody who knows what they're doing. It has other language in there which basically says that partial payment of the rent will not cure the default. Okay? That you need full and complete payment. Right?
Okay.
And if you make that full and complete payment, you're good, and they're not going to, generally, not going to evict you. That's for a couple reasons. One, because it's a pain for them to go through the whole process and then to rent out the apartment and to do everything else. Okay? And if you're not paying rent, it's because you lost your job and you don't have it. So if they have a judgment,
excuse me, would that security deposit cover a month's rent? Is that what the security is for when I first moved in the apartment?
No, that's
good question.
It's an excellent question. The security deposit is only to secure the condition of the apartment, that it's in the same condition as when you rented it, excepting ordinary wear and tear.
Yes, it cannot be used as rent. It cannot be used as the last month's rent. All those uses are totally inappropriate.
You can't use them as such, although a lot of times, truth be told, that's what happens.
Well, they offset the damages or the amount of the judgment, but really when someone says, just apply my security deposit to the rent,
Exactly.
that's not the proper way to handle it.
And that's not what it's for, and neither can the landlord just kind of keep it for that. All right?
Right. I look at the 5-day notice as the last chance for the tenant to become current. Otherwise, the landlord can go into court and file what's known as a forcible entry and detainer action. And that's the actual lawsuit to evict somebody, correct, Jesse?
Right, exactly. That's the fourth thing in our deal. The second thing is notice. The third thing is waiting for that time to pass. And then it's filing of the forcible entry and detainer action. There's no more self-help where, okay, you know what, I'm just going to walk in there and throw your stuff out. You can't do that. And if that's ever happened, I really suggest that you contact an attorney, because that is completely illegal and violates many civil and criminal laws on many different levels. And then the last thing, and then we'll go back and talk a little bit more about forcible entry and detainer, is getting that writ of eviction, where, hey, there's a date certain where the sheriff's deputies are going to come from whatever county you're at, and if you're not gone, they're going to take your stuff and they're going to put them on the curb, and I guarantee you, well, I can't guarantee you, but I'm pretty sure they're not going to be gentle with your stuff, okay? They're not movers.
Exactly.
All right? They're deputies that really don't want to do that, okay? And so they're going to be tossing your stuff.
You can pray for extremely cold weather, which will buy you a little additional time, because they will not evict under a certain temperature, I believe.
And you know what you can also do? We're putting the cart before the horse a little bit, but that's okay. You can, if there's a compelling reason or good cause, you can go back in and try to get that date extended. But that requires you to go into court and to file an appropriate motion to notice it up, which means to get it before the court for hearing, before that date that's set for eviction.
Right, and you better have a valid reason other than I just need a little more time to find an apartment when you haven't paid your rent in months. And the procedure's been going on for months.
Exactly. And the judges, well, I can tell you certainly here in DuPage, they're really good with in terms of time. You know, they're trying to balance in between, hey, listen, the landlord has a right to possession, quite frankly, of his premises if the lease has been broken and payment isn't made and he's losing money. And on the other hand, they're weighing, hey, listen, you know, this person, you know, we can't, you know, make them get out tomorrow. They can't give them a day. They need some time. So, you know, generally a week is what you get, but under certain conditions, you know, they'll give you 2, maybe 3 weeks. But they're very sympathetic and very, you know, in tune to those types of needs.
Ms. Jackson, do you have questions about the 5-day notice period?
Sure, the 5-day notice. Is it true that, after the 5-day notice, do they go before the judge to get this 5-day notice and he approves it? And then they come back and that's when the sheriffs come in to evict you?
No, actually the 5-day notice is a precursor. It's a condition precedent to being able to sue. Okay? And it's just a notice that they give you personally, right?
Correct.
Or they can mail it to you certified, or in some circumstances even tack it on your door, because sometimes people will they think that they take the ostrich approach, where if I bury my head in the sand, okay, and nobody can see me, then it's
nothing
okay.
Bad will happen.
Right, nothing bad will happen. Okay, and I'm here to tell you, okay, that it will. All right, it absolutely will.
You will be evicted.
You will be evicted. So they can post it too.
Right.
And
post it on the door.
They can post it on the door. And so
they don't necessarily
have to go
hand deliver it to you, huh?
No, they don't have to. That's the best way. That's what I try to do when I'm on the other side of these things, is to make sure, because I want to make sure that person, the whole idea is to give them an opportunity to cure.
Right.
You don't want to.
The landlord really doesn't want to evict. They don't really want to file suit. They want the rent.
The situations happen. I mean, people lose their jobs. You understand what I'm saying? You live with someone, they stop paying the rent, and what are you to do? You don't make enough money to pay your rent. All sorts of situations occur.
What are your experiences with that?
I've learned to have my own place the next time and pay my own rent instead of living with someone that opposed to him not paying the rent, and he was making the money.
Is that what happened?
The money. Yes, it is. I was living with an individual, and he wouldn't pay the rent. You can't live anywhere free. I'm aware of that. And he had a 5-day notice, and he ignored it, and they put the little sticky on the door. When they came to set us out, they started throwing things over the balcony.
They just tossed
That is
them out.
the ultimate in a forcible eviction.
Right.
They remove you and all the personal belongings in that apartment out to the curb.
That is correct.
And then all the neighbors see this, and they can pilferage through your stuff that's sitting at the curb.
Situation.
That's why it's
very
forcible.
Embarrassing.
Yeah, and I mean to kind of disrespect your stuff that brings up a whole other deal. But let me ask you, were you on the lease?
No, I was not on the lease. I was paying the utilities. He was the one on the lease. I was just living with him.
See, and that's also very important. That brings up a very good situation, because there are a lot of people that are in the same exact situation. Right? You want to make sure that that significant other or roommate is doing what they're supposed to do. You want to stay on top of that. And if you have a situation where there is a 5-day notice, even though you're not named on the lawsuit, you want to go to court because you want the judge to know, hey, you live here too.
Right.
But a lot of times what will happen, what you might be able to do is to talk to the landlord and to work something out with him in order to take care of that.
Right.
Okay?
The only good news in Miss Jackson's case is that she was not held to any judgment for the deficiency. They were not able to garnish her wages, and the judgment didn't earn 9% interest on her.
Right.
That was the only advantage.
Well, you can actually let's talk a little bit more about the forcible after the 5-day notice. The actual that's why you're talking about them throwing stuff out. Forcible entry.
That's right.
All right, Dana. So now you have your 5-day notice. The 5 days have expired, and you haven't called the landlord. You haven't paid the rent. You haven't paid partial rent. You haven't done anything. Okay. So generally, the landlord will go ahead and file.
Yeah. That basically opens the courthouse door now that the landlord can file the action against you and get the court proceeding rolling so that they're able to proceed with their eviction.
Right. Okay. And now the landlord can sue for one of two things, okay? Can sue for just possession alone, or can sue for possession and for the amount of the back rent.
And
now,
typically they're going to do both.
They're going to do both. Now what's going to happen, and what's kind of, and I'll try to quickly explain this, what's a little deficient about that system is that, hey, if I'm a landlord and you're behind 1 month, and now I wait for all this, and now we finally get into court, and when I filed it, it was just 1 month, and now the second month has passed, and now you owe me 2 months. In order for me to go after you for the second amount, I'm going to have to amend the complaint. And I'm going to have to get leave from the court to be able to amend my complaint to ask for that, and that requires me to serve you again. That requires you to have more time and everything else. So generally what they'll do is they'll just say, hey, the heck with that, and they'll go ahead and go into court. Anyway, so what happens, they file their forcible entry and detainer action. You're served by the sheriff or by a special process server. Okay? You get the summons and the complaint. It tells you a date and a time and a location to appear. And so you go in and you have your court date, and the judge will ask you whether or not you owe the money. A lot of times, I know in DuPage there was somebody from legal aid there, and if you meet a certain threshold, what they'll do is they'll let you go out and talk to that attorney who is there free of charge to assist people who are in certain financial straits or conditions. Okay, and they'll try to resolve it. And if not, then you could have a trial.
Right.
But guess what? It's generally not going to be that day.
It's going to be put over to another date.
Exactly.
So you
And it
still
could even
have
involve-
time, right?
You could.
It could even involve a jury, but we won't get into that right now. But the bottom line is the judge is typically going to ask, do you owe the money? And most people are going to honestly say yes, and the judge is going to say, how much time do you need to move?
That's exactly right.
But he doesn't care what you're going to say for how much time. He or she knows how much time they want to allow. But they just want to make sure that, they're within the realm of the necessary time, 2 to 3 weeks typically.
Okay.
Unless you have children, you might be able to get more.
Okay.
But the bottom line is, stay out of eviction court. Get into an apartment that you can afford, and if you can't, find another apartment, turn it over to the landlord so they can actually get somebody in there, mitigate the damages, and receive rental income.
Yeah, to talk to that brings up another point in terms of your lease. There's a clause that's what you call an assignability clause, which allows you, or sublease, to sublease it to somebody else. Most of the time, it requires the landlord's permission in writing. And when you do that, essentially, I'm on the lease, and I'm responsible. If I have permission to sublease to you, and I sublease to you, that's great. But if you default and you don't pay me, I'm still the one that is responsible for the payments. But you're right. I mean, and now, unfortunately, sometimes things happen, and you don't have, you lose your job, and the important thing is to communicate. Talk to the landlord, and to see what you can do. And again, if you're in those kind of dire straits, you know what, and you get that summons, hey, talk to the legal aid in your county to try to get some assistance.
Right.
You really need to talk to somebody.
So they will be willing to help you? I mean, legal aid financially, right?
If you meet the threshold, sure.
And did this show help you?
Of course it did. I learned a lot.
Did you pick up some pointers and tips when you're looking for your apartment now?
Yes, I did.
Well, Ms. Jackson, I want to let you know that we appreciate you very much for joining us.
Yes, we do.
Thank
Okay,
you
and
very
this
much
edition
for having
of
me as
Legal
a
Action.
guest.
And of course, Jesse Barrientos, we appreciate you as well.
Oh, thank you very
Thanks
much.
for being with me. I'm Dave Siegel for Legal Action. If you have a question that you would like answered, you can reach us at legalactiontv@aol.com, and we'll see you next time on Legal Action. Thank you very much.